but I think it seems so obvious that we should be building a North American innovation corridor and making sure that American and Canadian small businesses have access and understand how to use the digital tools that they need.
Welcome to Canusa Street, a podcast at the intersection of the issues and policies between Canada and the United States. Here are your hosts, Scotty Greenwood and Chris Sands.
Welcome to Canusa Street, everyone. I'm Christopher Sands, your solo host, as Scotty Greenwood is away. We have the opportunity today to talk to Jake Colvin, who is the president of the National Foreign Trade Council. It's the leading business association dedicated solely to advancing the interests of U.S. companies in international commerce. And that includes the interests of U.S. companies doing a lot of commerce with our sometime largest trading partner, Canada. So very important in the relationship. He is the co-founder of the Global Innovation Forum and directed the National Foreign Trade Council's USA Engage coalition to emphasize the benefits of U.S. economic, diplomatic, and citizen engagement in the global economy. He's a cleared advisor to the U.S. government and a member of the Trade and Environment Policy Advisory Committee, testifies before Congress. He's got a great media resume, talking foreign policy and trade with Business Week, Forbes, Politico, CNBC, CNN, NBC, NPR, and all of which is impressive. But I can also say that he is an alum of Johns Hopkins SAIS, which is a school that I teach at. And so I feel like I already know you. Jake, welcome to the program.
Christopher, thanks for having me. It's hard to believe, but it's my 20-year SAIS reunion this year, and so it's been a while.
Yes, it has been a while. I think we're similar in our, no, actually, I'm probably out 30 years now. Oh, gosh. Anyway, let's not talk about that. How did you get to this point? How did you find your way to the head of the National Foreign Trade Council?
Well, yeah, sure. So, look, I grew up in Long Island, New York, and as you said, went to the University of Richmond, did my undergraduate there, and came to DC with this kind of vague idea that I wanted to do something international. And so finally, with that in mind, landed as a legal assistant at a law firm, Steptoe, here in Washington, DC, and really got to sort of see the nuts and bolts of trade law. And so worked on anti-dumping and countervailing duty cases like Canadian lumber. And then following that, I went to SAIS, the Johns Hopkins program, and did a master's there. And while I was there, I met Bill Reinsch, who at the time was the president of the National Foreign Trade Council, and a SAIS alum who was doing a career fair.
And someone who's been a guest on this program. So we'll put a note to his episode in the notes for the episode. But anyway, go ahead, sir.
Terrific. Look, so kept in touch with Bill, and and that sort of really to me brought home the value of informational interviews because I did one with him, and then kept in touch. And at some point, an interesting job came open. And so I came to NFTC in 2005 at a director level to run our USA Engage program, as you mentioned. And I've been there for 18 years. So been had a number of opportunities to grow. As you mentioned, I founded the Global Innovation Forum, which engages small businesses in conversations about how they're going global and participating in the global marketplace. And then I was grateful to have been named president 2 years ago. And so, these days I get to spend some of my time, at least, thinking about the future strategic direction for NFTC and growing the organization. It's been fun. It's been challenging, and I'm really enjoying what I'm doing.
Fantastic. But that means, if I'm following the timeline, that you were at the National Foreign Trade Council throughout the renegotiation of NAFTA, or the negotiation of the USMCA, I guess we should say. And we're in several years in, a little bit more than 3 years into the USMCA now. How do you assess the current trade relationship between Canada and the US in light of all of that? Are we in good shape, or still some concerns?
Well, I mean, if you think back to it was about 2018 when President Trump was threatening to sign a bilateral trade agreement with Mexico and leave Canada out, perhaps as a negotiating tactic. But the relationship has absolutely had its ups and downs, even lately. I would say right now, I worry that the bilateral relationship between the United States and Canada is more fraught than it should be. We're each other's largest trading partners. We're generally like-minded. We generally have similar approaches to regulation, and we're really close partners on national security and foreign policy. But in addition to these sort of everyday bilateral frictions that are always there, there's dairy and automobiles. There's always lumber. My worry is that we've been layering on new frictions, particularly around industrial policies and digital. And so, as I look around, we see Canada singling out American companies through this idea of a digital services tax, and some other members like this Online News Act and Online Streaming Act. But from on our side, we've heard the criticisms of U.S. industrial policies, not taking into account the North American marketplace, which dates back to Build Back Better, which eventually made its way in a different form into the Inflation Reduction Act.
Right.
For me, the concern is that these frictions are sort of more pronounced because we don't really seem to be united enthusiastically around a positive or forward-looking trade agenda. Canada isn't part of this IPEF that the United States is pursuing. The United States certainly isn't banging down the door to get into CPTPP. And you have forums where, our countries would normally take a leadership role, like the World Trade Organization and the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, really sort of hamstrung by geopolitics. And so, it's sort of hard to get anything done with China and Russia at the table.
Well, absolutely. They're certainly not on our Christmas card list in either country. But since you mentioned the DST, the Digital Services Tax, how do you think that's going to go forward? I mean, what are the specific concerns, I guess, that you have about it? It's been much talked about, and I know it's something that has me nervous because it seems more like a manufactured dispute between Canada and the U.S., ready-made, than something that would be likely to go forward. What's your view?
That really is a concern that I share. And I think broadly, it's just completely unnecessary and avoidable as an irritant for the U.S.-Canada relationship. And if Canada continues to pursue it, it's hard to see how it does anything but lead to more trade frictions with the United States. Right. At a time where I think we really ought to be aligned on trade broadly, but also on digital. We've seen. We have personally expressed concern, and other fellow trade associations have done so as well. But Ambassador Tai and the U.S. Trade Representative's office have raised this repeatedly. And then you look to our Congress and Senators Wyden and Crapo, who are the chair and ranking members of the Senate Finance Committee, have called Canada's DST targeted discriminatory taxation that would need to be addressed as part of USMCA. I know Scotty's not here today, but I saw the op-ed that she and Beth wrote, and I think she said something about Canada's go-it-alone approach that carries great risk. And, she asked the question, do you really want to provoke the United States on this? And I think she's right. You're going to have businesses and government looking to explore every tool in the toolbox to express concern and push back on this from the United States. And that's frankly just not going to be good for anyone.
No, absolutely. And it is a big concern for the Canada-US relationship. Now, you also mentioned the Online News Act, which I think is C-18 in Canada. Can you explain a little bit how that would likely play out? And I know that Meta and Google have been actually keeping Canada off the news feeds because of this potential legislation. But why are people so stressed about it? What's your sense?
So look, I'm not sure I have a crystal ball here for either the Online News Act or the Online Streaming Act, but which I guess is what, C-11?
I think so, yes. Yep.
But
producer says yes.
Okay. But in both cases, the concern is that it's really targeting a very small range of U.S. Digital companies here. And, in the case of the Online News Act, it would require them to essentially pay to, link to news articles or to otherwise display snippets and news stories. the internet is built on linking to things, and so there's a fundamental concern that this kind of action just undermines the very nature of an open global internet. But it also more specifically raises national treatment and performance requirement concerns under the USMCA, which could also be said of the Online Streaming Act. And so, I think on the Online Streaming Act, that could also have implications for content production and distribution globally, and the ability of American, content creators to succeed and thrive on platforms available to Canadians. I think the Online News Act is front and center because, as you mentioned, Meta has already restricted access to links to Canadian users for news articles. And so it's, both of those issues are a concern, but, I think they play into a larger concern about a kind of Canada turning fire on, its closest ally rather than the two of our countries being joined at the hip on digital policy.
It's funny because over the years, I've gotten to know some of the reporters who, are out in Washington covering various beats, and so many of them are Canadian. So they're coming down to the U.S. They're able to engage freely and openly in the media. Their careers are prospered. It's that openness which has tended to work in both directions, creating opportunities for both sides. It seems a shame to sort of put news media in the same basket as, say, Canadian culture, where you take a very restrictive approach. But even on film, Canada's always said Hollywood films, American productions are allowed on screens in Canada. They've just said, hey, we want to put a little support behind Canadian film so that our voice is heard. And maybe a subsidy or support role, I don't think would be as controversial, but to try to restrict access or tax does seem to me to be a little bit more, maybe that's too harsh a term, but protectionist.
And I think it's frustrating because, I think sometimes politicians sort of confuse who they're competing with or against. And usually for me, this frustration surfaces with respect to the European Union, whose policies, tend to suggest that their biggest strategic competitor is the United States rather than China. But I think it seems so obvious that, we should be building a North American innovation corridor and making sure that American and Canadian small businesses have access and understand how to use the digital tools that they need to engage effectively in the global marketplace. And the idea that instead we're going to be fighting about, Canada's digital policies just seems demoralizing.
It is demoralizing, at least at some level. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll be asking Jake Colvin a little bit about the global agenda.
What did Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King and President Woodrow Wilson have in common? Yes, they both led their countries during wartime, but they were also the only leaders of their countries to hold a PhD. At the Wilson Center's Canada Institute, we follow these academic civil servants to bring the public the best nonpartisan research and analysis. We're the only think tank in DC focused on this vital relationship. So in addition to the great repartee you get to hear on Canusa Street, head over to wilsoncenter.org to check out the Canada Institute's work and events.
Welcome back to Canusa Street, everyone. This is Chris Sands, and I'm having a conversation today without Scotty, much missed, with Jake Colvin, president of the National Foreign Trade Council. We were talking about some of the relationships on the digital economy, some of the issues that have arisen before the break, but I know you were also thinking about some of the positive elements of the bilateral relationship in this sector.
Well, thank you, Christopher. And I didn't want to leave it on such a dismal note. I think, if you look back just even to a couple of years ago about the lessons that we learned from the pandemic, in the United States, 3 out of 4 small businesses increased their use of digital tools in response. And I came across another survey by a Canadian firm that found that 55% of small businesses in Canada who had an existing online presence saw their sales either rise or stay the same during the pandemic. And so, I think one lesson coming out of the pandemic is that digital tools are a lifeline for small businesses. So I actually had the opportunity to spend a really incredible week with my family in the Canadian Rockies over the summer. I was in Banff. I met a woman named Gail Holton, who founded the Rocky Mountain Flannel Company. And so we had a great conversation. She was remarkably well-versed on Canada's trade policy and all of their free trade agreements. And I went and looked her up afterwards, and she uses digital platforms, including Facebook, Instagram, Shopify, PayPal, FedEx, to connect with customers all over the world, as well as her suppliers. She sources most of her flannels from Portugal. And so, small businesses, I think, get the importance of digital and of being digital and global intuitively, even, those who are not as well versed as Gail on trade policy. And so, I think there's this, it's not even an opportunity, it's sort of a necessity of making sure that the United States and Canada are aligned on digital, and making sure that those small businesses in our countries are able to use those tools effectively to go get at global markets.
Well, one of the things that I think is most promising in the USMCA was the discussion about inclusive trade, which I think at first people were wondering, who needs to be included, how does it go? But as the governments have interpreted it, trying to bring more people in trade, they focused on SMEs, which are more likely to be headed by women or racialized minorities, others who are participating, really just getting a business started. And so the idea of helping small and medium-sized enterprises to participate in bilateral trade is very much part of that agenda. So if we get the digital economy right, it's a positive step for inclusion, I would say.
Well, and that's exactly right. And there's evidence that suggests in the United States experience that women-owned and minority-owned small businesses who engage in the global marketplace are more productive, pay higher wages, have more longevity than businesses that don't. And so this is one area where I do think that the United States and Canada, really could be doing even more to cooperate. Canada's been a leader on including gender commitments in trade agreements. And I think, to the extent that we can get back to a positive trade agenda where the United States and Canada are really in the driver's seat, there's much more that we can do together to make sure that, we reflect the importance of supporting women and underserved communities through our trade policies.
And I'm glad you mentioned underserved communities, because I know a priority for the Canadian government has been opening up to Indigenous communities in Canada, often in remote areas for whom the digital connection is the lifeline to the much bigger markets that are around them. So very much, I think, something Canadians innovated on, and I think I'm glad it's in the USMCA.
Well, and we've done some work on this through our Global Innovation Forum, where we've gone out and interviewed some Indigenous small businesses. We did this for a report through the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, and it really is a way for digital tools help communities diversify and sell their products to a broader audience. In some cases, it's a lifeline. We interviewed another small business in Mexico who said that she both didn't feel safe walking down the street, and when she went to meetings with investors was met with skepticism in Mexico. And so as she developed more of a global online presence, she was able to kind of provide proof of the success of her business and get credibility that way. Where for one reason or another, she lacked it. She wasn't able to get that credibility or visibility locally.
Oh, that's a great story. I don't want to be too parochial in talking about North America, because I know you're about all of the foreign trade. I wonder, can Canada and the U.S. form some kind of common cause or work together? Globally, we've got forums like the WTO, which is stuck. We don't have enough appellate body judges. Alan Wolf, our former ambassador to the WTO, has been talking about gestures of reform lately. And you have APEC. We're coming up on an APEC summit, I think, later this year, where Canada and the U.S. are in the same club. Can we work to make those clubs better and perhaps strike a blow for global trade, global open trade together rather than fighting bilaterally?
So I think despite the geopolitical challenges, it's really important for the United States and Canada to show leadership and position venues like the World Trade Organization and APEC as opportunities to address shared global priorities. if we don't do that, then countries will go in other directions, and you saw that a short time ago with the RCEP, the trade agreement that China helped lead without the
Right.
United States in the Asia Pacific, and now you have the expansion of the BRICS, and so you have these attempts to create alternative power centers among groups of countries that are certainly not friends of the United States or perhaps Canada. And so, I mean, I just, I get the challenges, but if you look at even during the pandemic, I thought the WTO was valuable as a forum to discuss lessons learned for trade and health. Canada has played a really important role in leading this so-called Ottawa Group's work. And the Ottawa Group did a lot to surface ideas and proposals on trade and health during the pandemic. The WTO has this committee on trade facilitation that they set up, which discussed best practices, which allowed medicines and critical goods to get where they needed to be during the pandemic. And so the WTO did prove, I think, its worth as a forum to discuss these issues that were happening in real time. One other venue that I would point out, which sometimes gets overlooked, is the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development.
Oh, right.
To me, that's an increasingly important place where the United States and Canada can show joint leadership and make progress. So it's a forum that does not include Russia or China. They've historically done really good work and analysis on digital trade, on trade facilitation. They're engaged in a number of science and technology issues, artificial intelligence. And now you have a group of countries knocking on the door to try to join. And so Brazil and I think 4 other countries have begun, the accession process. And during that process, it provides an opportunity to sort of kick the tires on their policies and make sure that, Brazil is following best practices with respect to trade and tax policy. And so, to me, that's an important place for business to be, because it's an opportunity to have a really robust conversation among like-minded countries and those who would like to join the club.
Well, and it's a more inclusive club in the sense that it doesn't include China and Russia, but it does include Mexico. It includes Japan, South Korea. So it's a bit more global in that sense. It's got some very, very good economic partners for the United States and Canada in it at the table, even though we sometimes say, oh, some of these countries belong in the global south or they're in the IPEF territory. We've already included them and have a platform for dialogue, which is something I think both U.S. and Canada would prize at this time.
Yeah, completely agree.
Now, you mentioned AI, and I want to talk a little bit about sort of the cutting edge issues in trade. You mentioned softwood lumber earlier. That's an oldie but a goodie, but there are some new issues coming up, AI and so forth. Where do you think we could be working together on global trade to maybe build a sort of Canada-U.S. tag team position to try to advance some rules?
I mean, you mentioned lumber, and whether it's lumber or rice or automobiles, there are a number of issues where it feels like Groundhog Day.
Yes.
And so, I think with respect to AI, as well as other emerging technologies like blockchain, advanced cloud services, fintech, these are exciting areas to do some fresh thinking from a trade policy perspective. Policymakers are grappling with how to regulate these technologies. And so, you have the United States and EU and Canada and others all taking different approaches to things like regulation of artificial intelligence. But then you also have countries starting to think through how to cooperate and even write these issues into trade agreements. So you have the Digital Economy Partnership Act that New Zealand, Singapore, and Chile have signed, where they start talking about developing fintech sandboxes among the members, and about sharing information and cooperation on artificial intelligence. Through the U.S. and EU Trade and Technology Council, they're establishing this code of conduct on AI. And so, I think it's exciting to start thinking about the idea of regulating domestically and cooperating globally at the same time, and where should business be as we advocate for our priorities. I would also note that AI and some of these other advanced technologies are also increasingly being thought of from a national security context. And so, if you look at AI in particular, this is classified as an emerging technology that will be controlled for national security purposes. In the United States, we denied access to tools to train large AI models as part of the rationale for U.S. export controls on advanced computers and chips. And I know Secretary Raimondo just came back from China, and she talked about the idea of erring on the side of caution when it comes to limiting China's access to advanced AI tools. I mean, this is an emerging space, and there's still sort of a lot of unknown. And so I think there is a desire to be cautious.
Well, and probably that's prudent. One other area that I think Canada and the U.S. have been talking about, particularly since COVID, are supply chains. And whether it's trying to keep bad things out of the supply chain, like forced labor, or measuring the carbon impact of a supply chain, or looking at supply chain resilience, maybe the impact of additive manufacturing to make up some parts so that you don't extend your supply chain just for low cost, to one side of the world or the other. How can what makes sense for the agenda on supply chains between the two countries? Are there some things that we need to address more urgently? Maybe some topics to include for a future Canusa Street podcast episode, even.
So look, I mean, I think it's important for the United States and Canada, as well as all like-minded countries, to collaborate on shared challenges with respect to supply chains, particularly including forced labor, but also, anti-counterfeit efforts. I think the challenge is that over the past several years, there's been an increasing burden placed on businesses to just, root out counterfeits and forced labor from their supply chains. I do think that there is an opportunity, going back to the last question, of utilizing emerging technologies like AI and blockchain to help with some of the challenges with supply chains. And so, if you're looking, I know the United States and Canada are both taking a fresh look at customs modernization procedures and data requirements for entry. And then, to address the challenges of forced labor, or even, as you said, Christopher, measuring the carbon footprint, there is a promise, at least, or a hope that new technology tools could provide more certainty and more seamless access to data that would facilitate, meeting some of those challenges. So, if you think about some of the use cases in trade for blockchain or AI, they include, certifying the origin of goods, and making sure that products were not made with forced labor. And so, to me, that's another sort of exciting prospect for the use of emerging technologies for trade.
Jake Colvin, I have to say that there's a pattern here, which is that while you're realist about the challenges, as you were about digital economy and about supply chains, you always end on a positive, optimistic note, which may be your personality, but I think it's refreshing. Are you, as we come to the end, this idea of Canada-U.S. trade that we started with, there's a lot we can do bilaterally in this trade relationship, and a lot still to be done. Would you agree?
Well, look, if you only focus on the negative, it would be hard to get out of bed in the morning. I will say that one of the best parts of my job over the past 18 years has been engaging with startups and small businesses who talk about how they engage in the global economy, but also about how they founded their businesses. And so, I've had the opportunities to work with Startup Canada, do a roundtable event in Ottawa where we got to know a number of Canadian small businesses. And it's just, that optimism is sort of generated over and over again. And that's part of what keeps me going on those days where things look a little bit bleak.
I appreciate that. Canusa Street, it's always sunny on both sides of the street, so we appreciate the optimism. Jake Colvin, president of the National Foreign Trade Council, thanks for coming on Canusa Street. I'm sorry I didn't have Scotty for you, but you're welcome back anytime.
Good to be with you, Christopher. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
This podcast is brought to you by the Canadian American Business Council and the Wilson Center. If you like this episode, help others find our show, and give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.